Welcome everyone to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman. I'm a senior fellow here that works on global health policy and financing issues. And today I'm pleased to welcome Tristan Reed, who's an economist in the Development Economics Research Group of the World Bank, and my colleague, Anthony McDonald, who's a senior policy analyst here at the Center for Global Development. Our topic today is developing a plan to vaccinate the world. Of course, this has been on the agenda since March of 2020. But the relative understanding of the issues involved, the priority that needed to be given, indeed, what need actually looked like in countries all over the world, given different age structures, given different dynamics of the disease. All of that has been evolving over time, the manufacturing landscape, et cetera. So we're really going to dive in today at sort of the constituent pieces of a plan to vaccinate the world: need, demand, and supply. What do we know? What don't we know? What can we get done? And it's a good time to do it because today there is a summit to complete the financing of COVAX, which is the facility that is pooling donations from high income countries, philanthropy, and private donors to purchase vaccines for the so-called advanced market commitment 92 countries, a group of low income and lower middle income countries. Their goal is 30% coverage of the population in these countries. There's also a call to share 1 billion doses from high income countries that have purchased surplus. Earlier in the week, or actually just last week, of course, every day is like a week in this time period. But we saw the IMF, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization come together and call for 50 billion in financing, again, through different mechanisms to get this job done, to vaccinate the world and to address the terrible inequities that we see. But before all that happened, Tristan Reed and his colleague Rashir Agarwal at the International Monetary Fund actually wrote a paper that laid out some of these issues and in some ways is the basis on which this IMF proposal came out and then the subsequent call was launched. So I'm going to turn it over to Tristan to take us through both that paper, but also what he's learned since then. What do we know now? And then I'll go to Anthony as a discussant and we'll have a conversation and take your questions as well. So over to you, Tristan. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Amanda. Put this up. Can everybody see? Good. Yeah, so just a few things. So first, this is based off of and builds on a paper with Ruchir Agarwal you can find online. It's called How to End the COVID-19 Pandemic by March 2022. I'll talk about whether that date is still feasible. And then second, these are my own views as a researcher and don't reflect the perspective of the World Bank or its governors. So just to give you a roadmap of what I want to cover today, and some motivation, the economic gain from ending the pandemic earlier is huge. I think this is very well recognized. Just as a rule of thumb, you can think that a country loses about 1% of GDP each month it doesn't have herd immunity. And that's sort of about the rate, a bit more than the rate that China lost GDP at the very beginning of 2020. So, if you take this rate, you look over, all low middle income countries, that's about 320 billion per month that you're losing. And then, so this is just, within countries. It could be a bit less, could be a bit more, but, that's a sort of private loss for low and middle income countries not vaccinating their populations. There are then also costs to rich countries. So, this has been, very well reported that, if you have, inequality in vaccine coverage, there could be new variants that are more transmissible or deadly. You're seeing this in the United Kingdom right now, which has had, an outbreak of this Delta variant first discovered in India. And, it's well known that the AstraZeneca vaccine was actually ineffective against one variant found in South Africa, now called the Beta. They had to take time to change the vaccine to make it effective against this new variant. Today, though, I want to make, a central argument. So this is that, supply chain bottlenecks are binding in the short run. I think, you're going to hear stories about bioreactor bags and glass vials. But there's a sense in which that would have been expected, right? We're scaling vaccine production, to more than it's ever been done at one time. Of course, there are going to be input supply constraints. But what I want to argue today is that it's actually insufficient demand from government that has been the greatest barrier to global vaccine equity. And I think it's pretty clear that trillions could have been saved by making a relatively small investment and commitment to COVAX in 2020 instead of 2021, which is what happened. Had that happened, you would have seen the same supply bottlenecks, but they would have you would have learned about them earlier, and you would have had more chance to resolve them. Today, however, we are in I think a pretty good position. About 2 to 4 billion in additional donor commitments are needed to get to 60% population coverage in every country, and I'll tell you why that's an important number. Just as a roadmap, we're going to go demand, supply, and I'm going to talk about the gap in pre-purchases required to get to the 60% threshold. That was the core analysis of my paper with Ruchir. And then I'll talk about options to fill that gap, and also some of my reflections, having worked on this response at the bank. And these options also come from the paper. Just these are data from yesterday. There's still a large degree of inequality. Israel, you're at 60%. The United States, you have 50, but countries like Pakistan have 2%, Vietnam 1%, the Democratic Republic of the Congo at 1%. So you're still quite far from where we need to be. Let's talk about how much vaccines are needed. So I think you may have seen these headlines. I think the New York Times is really running hard with this message that we might never reach herd immunity. In my view, that's a little sensational, and let me explain to you why. So I think we should say that the theory and the epidemiology of this is very, very well understood. So there's one equation that shows you what is the threshold to achieve herd immunity. It's in our paper, and we've talked to epidemiologists about this. And it basically gives you this this threshold as a function of two main variables. One is the effectiveness of the vaccine, and the other is the share of the population with prior infection. So that's on the rows, and the effectiveness is on the columns. If you assume, we assume here also that you can get reinfected, so it's not perfect immunity from prior infection, but nonetheless you get some. You kind of get this range of values. So you can see that, say you're the United States, you're using mostly Pfizer. You have relatively low share of the population with prior infections, say 10%. We don't know exactly what it is, but it might be around there. Then 54% is about the number you need. However, if you use a less effective vaccine, that could go up to 78. So there is a range, but the theory is quite clear. I think the key assumption here, though, is that in the model, everyone is mixing with each other, randomly in a uniform way. And so what you want is that distribution to be vaccines to be uniform across the population and also across countries. So when the Times is saying we may never reach it, what they're really saying is, well, there could be pockets in the United States that don't achieve this threshold level, and so the virus will continue to transmit there. But it is true that in places like, say, New York City, where they're kind of getting to the threshold, the transmission will be lower. And just to give you some context, the Africa CDC has taken 60% as its target. That's still more than the adult population in some countries, so you do need to think about immunizing adolescents eventually. But I think if you look at where countries are now, you can kind of explain the cases or not by whether they've reached the threshold. So US, UK, Israel, have basically stopped the spread. Little uptake in the UK, but it's not extreme. Chile, they've been made quite a lot of progress, but they also used Sinovac, which could be a slightly less effective vaccine, so that may explain why they need to get more. And then Seychelles, they used Sinopharm, which is actually, quite effective, but they also had a very low share of prior infection. So, they're at about 60. The threshold there is 65. So I think, again, I don't want to be too sanguine, but here's the theory, and it certainly says that you don't need to get to 100% of the population coverage. One question is about hesitancy. So do people want it? And I think generally the survey evidence, this is from Nature, it's been kind of updated since that original paper. It shows that in most countries, you have around 60% or more of the population willing to take the vaccine. So Russia is lower here, but at least at the levels of vaccination we are at in most lower middle income countries, you're not yet hitting the point where people might be unwilling to take it. Similarly, in the United States, in the U.S. at least, you're seeing that a lot of people that would say, oh, I'll wait and see. Now they're making appointments, and a lot of people also just perhaps didn't have the time or ability to go. So I don't think that hesitancy in a general sense is binding constraint at the moment. However, the big issue is really been about governments making purchases. So I want to give you sort of 3 examples here. So the first is the United States, this high-income country, and what they did is they made a lot of pre-purchases of vaccines before regulatory approval. So by August of 2020, Operation Warp Speed had contracted for at least 300 million doses. And paid for them in advance. So the countries knew they were going to sell them, and they had the cash in the bank. And today, we have almost 300 million doses in arms and about 50% of the population covered. So that, I think that is the story of if you pay about a year in advance, then you get the delivery in people's arms a year later. Contrast this with India, a lower middle income country. In February of 2021, they'd only ordered 21 million vaccines from the largest producer, which had a license in the country. It did not scale up its orders domestically until March of this year, when infections rose in the second wave. And then subsequently, in April, it actually shut exports and started essentially taking vaccines which had been ordered for other uses, but diverting them to domestic use. And today they have 210 doses in arms, and that's about 12% of the population. Clearly the coverage as a share of the population is less than in the United States. So you might think that India, it's a pretty large country. It could afford to order in advance, but there are a lot of countries that couldn't. You say a country has $1,000 GDP per capita. If a course of vaccines is priced high at say $40, that's like the Sinopharm, or actually others in that range too. That could be 4% of GDP, which is a lot of money. So the donor, the COVAX, was set up for poor countries to basically buy vaccines on their behalf. It established its goal of covering about 20% of 91 countries, and then a little bit less of India because of its size, or not a little bit, a bit less of India because of its size. They set this goal of raising 7 billion, but they only got 1.4 billion in commitments by September, and they didn't even have the full amount by April of this year. So they have now been able to make commitments, but they were very slow in being able to do this and actually, legally commit to pre-purchase vaccines. And part of that was because they didn't have money in the bank. So, in the case of India, you had this delay to purchase relative to the United States. And also in the case of COVAX, you had a delay in funds being made available so that it could actually go into the market and make purchases. Okay, so there's been a big difference in how the U.S. operated here, and as well as other countries. Okay, so what explains this? So I think here's three potential reasons. So one, I think that low infection rates in Asia and Africa, may have fed complacency. This is something I wrote about, very early on, that mortality had been much lower in lower income countries. It's still true in a lot of places. The Indian government budget is huge, 220 billion. So it's quite difficult to explain, the lack of purchases with lack of funds in this case in particular. So you need to say, there was some unwillingness to pay perhaps on the part of the government. A second issue is that the facilities of development banks, the World Bank is one such facility, didn't actually allow for pre-purchases before regulatory approval. So, Operation Warp Speed was able to go and buy from Johnson & Johnson, buy from Pfizer before they were even approved by the FDA. The World Bank, basically required that its funds could not be used unless a vaccine had already achieved regulatory emergency use authorization. And I think you can see quite clearly that though money is going out the door, the rate of uptake has been quite slow. So, this facility was established in October. You only had 1.6 billion as of March, and I think a big part of that was just that you couldn't spend it on many vaccines that were in the market. So this facility may be helpful, but it's not helpful in bringing demand forward in the way that the U.S. and COVAX were able to do. Point three is that COVAX was set up to kind of get around this regulatory issue, and it was able to go purchase vaccines in advance before regulatory approval. But it didn't. But even though donors committed, it was the case that many donors, though they promised to give the money, they didn't actually give it to them in the bank. And my evidence for this is that the U.S. offered an additional $2 billion, and it said when existing donor pledges are fulfilled, and this hasn't yet been released. It may be released today. We don't know. And importantly, COVAX wasn't able to borrow against these commitments, and so therefore, again, didn't have cash in the bank to move. And this is something I'll get to at the end, but I think it's an interesting question. Why not? If rich donors had promised to give to COVAX, that's presumably a good credit risk and something that you could have lent on. So these are, I think, the shortcomings of the development bank model, potential complacency in or let's say low demand at the government level in low and middle income countries, and then also unfulfilled commitments to COVAX. So why was this so important? So I think it's important to think through the theory and kind of contract theory about this. So vaccine manufacturers take two distinct challenges, and I think it's really important to separate these out. So the first you can call inventory risk. And this is just the idea that, if you're running a private company and you buy inputs to make something that you then can't sell, that's kind of wasted capital from your perspective. You're just sitting on it. And so typically, firms don't buy supplies without a commitment to buy. And this is, there's a quote from the Serum Institute, the CEO, Adar Poonawalla, says, I only had orders for 1 billion. Everyone's saying I need to deliver 3. You only promised to buy 1 billion. Why would I go out into the market and buy supplies for more? And another thing that is important is that I think everyone became enamored of these option contracts. As this was giving people a lot of new value. These don't actually solve the problem unless you pay the firm the full price in advance, which the option price is always lower because the buyer doesn't want to commit to buy. So these contracts, I think they gave people perhaps a false sense of security that they had access, but they didn't actually solve the problem of reducing inventory risk for the manufacturers. And if you look at the COVAX contracts, one of the things they did was they signed a lot of kind of non-legally binding agreements without a commitment to buy. These made for nice press releases, but because they didn't have the money into the bank, it was unclear, at what time they would have been delivered and if, capacity was actually being activated to produce those. So I think, so that's one issue. The second issue is about access to capital. So, suppose a firm does have a commitment to buy. It knows it's going to sell. Its buyers legally bound to buy when the thing's produced. But the firm needs working capital, say, to buy bioreactor bags or glass vials. Here, there's a question of whether they can borrow from banks. Do they have enough cash, on the books to do it? Do they have access to credit lines? I think that probably for these major companies, that's probably not an issue. They're very large companies with access to credit. The U.S. Development Finance Corporation, International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, have made funds available in case this constraint binds, but it's not. From IFC perspective, it's not clear that much is being taken up again. I think because firms do have access to capital. But I think, so CGD, Prashant Yadav and co-authors, they had this paper where they observed this in March. So they said, relaxing capital constraints, giving subsidized credit is not actually sufficient and going to incentivize investment unless you guarantee demand and resolve the inventory risk. What do you take from this? Well, Michael Kramer and co-authors had this paper, in Science, which makes the case that said, adding more production capacity is something with huge economic returns. What did they mean by capacity, though? They meant not just a manufacturing location, but quality control and actually purchasing the inputs that were needed. The way that you achieve this is by pre-purchasing the vaccines. So if you solve the inventory risk, then the companies, we're going to place orders with input suppliers. At this point, I really want to, focus on, there's nothing innovative about this. I think a lot of papers came out and said, we need innovative finance, we want complicated option contracts. No, just buy it. Say, I'm going to buy this from you. I will pay it from you, pay you when it's delivered. That's the way that you bring more capacity online. And I'll say that this is something that happens in other industries. So if you've been following, there's a shortage of semiconductor chips at the moment, which has been hitting the auto industry particularly hard. Tesla went into the market recently and they said, how we're going to deal with this is we're going to pay in advance for semiconductor chips. And this is something that generally manufacturers don't want to do. They like the flexibility of being able to, move capacity between customers. That helps their profitability. But, in this case, the way they bring on new capacity and make sure they have enough capacity to serve, one client, in particular Tesla in this case, was that Tesla purchased in advance. So, I think the business of this was often lost, but firms are not going to produce things unless you pay for it, and there's really no getting around that. So let me turn now to the supply side, and what I want to argue here is that essentially these weren't constraints because of the demand that was in the market, though the demand could have been a bit larger. So. On the research and development side, this is a slide from Ruchir and his co-author. The funding from governments, the size of the market led to an extraordinary amount of research effort in terms of COVID-19 vaccines. This is kind of more clinical trials than you've seen before ever. And actually much more than you'd predict based on the market. So there doesn't seem to have been any kind of market failure here. There's a huge market available, and researchers responded. One thing we look at the paper is that there's now at least 10 vaccines with more than 50% efficacy using different technologies. 50% is this threshold that the FDA and the WHO have established. Clearly there's some variation. I showed you that does have implications for when you can achieve herd immunity, but there've been a large number of products now that are, there is evidence that they're effective, and they're in, some have been approved by national regulatory authorities, other are in different stages of review by the WHO and so forth. Production capacity also doesn't seem to be an issue. This is a slide from Airfinity, which was commissioned by the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations. And across a number of candidates, there does seem to be available production. It's a little bit backloaded. It'll come at the end of the year, but they have been scaling up. And again, I want to say there's obviously some error here. People have had delays, but other firms have been able to accelerate production. But it does seem like we're going to have a large amount. I think they revised this recently up to 11 billion by the end of the year. So here's kind of a summary of where supply meets demand. This is again from our paper. So here, on the leftmost column, that's the stated capacity of firms to produce. So that's overall what they said they could produce at the beginning of the year. That production that's realized may be less than that, but it seems like they were at least saying we can sell you enough for the whole population. Contrast this though to the second column, which says that basically about half that has been ordered. And now I want to say this is some orders have happened since we produced these charts, but the basic picture is still right, that you have enough for about half of the world population, and you're gonna need to get to 60 or a bit more. So there is this gap in under purchases overall, even though firms were saying, we'll take your orders. And the second issue is that you see that there's this unequal distribution of purchases across countries. So high-income countries have purchased more than their population, and then low and middle-income countries have purchased much less than their population. And in the population here, I'm including India and China, which I'll show on the next slide. So here is, this is again from our paper, this is that picture at the country level. And this picture, I think has a few differences from a standard graph that you've seen. We made two modifications here. One is that Russia, China, and India, which have substantial production capacity, we colored them green because even though in the Duke data set you don't see that they've made orders, they have their own capacity domestically, and so from that perspective can fill the need if they choose to. The second thing that we've done is, instead of just looking at direct procurement by individual countries, we have allocated the orders from both COVAX and all the money it has available in commitments and how much that could buy in terms of vaccines. We've taken those orders, and we've also taken orders from regional procurement initiatives like the African Union, and allocated those to the member countries in proportion to their population. And I think this picture, which was in our paper in April, I think does give a bit more optimistic picture than you might see in most cases. Importantly, Africa is kind of at the 50% range when you take into account contracts of the African Union and also of COVAX. And the real big gaps are in sort of this Middle East, Central Asia region. I'll say one final thing is that there is a bit of sort of some contracts are not observed. So Mongolia here is a country that didn't appear to have purchased a lot of vaccines, but it's actually achieved a lot through deliveries from through deliveries from China and Russia, which didn't come up necessarily in these Duke data. So this is the basis of our data. We took only the publicly available contracts. And so what does this analysis tell you? Well, only 345, sorry, that should be million courses are needed to cover 60% of the population in these 91 countries that COVAX has said are eligible for subsidies. Now, just to review a little bit, COVAX said, it designated 91 countries as being, the poorest and thus eligible for subsidies. Together, they have a population of about 1.25 billion. And then India is added, but they have reduced access. Again, as I said, this coverage comes about 30% from existing direct procurement, and then 30% will come from COVAX. Just to give you an example of the existing procurement, the African Union has a deal with Johnson & Johnson to deliver 220 million doses. Again, I should have written millions, with an option to extend to 400. So it has access at least to enough to cover the population. The countries do need to fill those orders now that the contract has been signed, but financing is available to cover that cost. And also because Johnson & Johnson has been approved, there's not this issue that you can't use the World Bank funding. From the AMC perspective, so they've said, in a press release recently that, today they needed $2 billion extra dollars, and that would allow them to cover 30% of the population. So it really does seem like we should be there. In our paper in April, we said the additional financing is $4 billion. You can reconcile that with their number in one of two ways. One is that they received some commitments that haven't been made public yet. So I think when we were doing it, they said they were at 6.3 billion. They may have gotten 2 billion in the background. Another is that they may have access to lower prices at the moment. So we assume $12 per course based on their previous numbers. But overall, I think this is a pretty optimistic picture for the poorest countries. It seems like financing, at least for 60% of the population, is lined up. India is a different story. They're much larger. They have reduced access under COVAX. And so there you're going to need 510 million to reach this, but the country does have domestic manufacturing capacity. One thing finally to look at is that often we group low and middle income countries together because that's how the World Bank thinks about things. But the upper middle countries that don't have access to subsidized vaccines really have covered most of their orders. So for example, Peru has a contract with Pfizer for 50% of the population, and then there's an additional contract with AstraZeneca that could give them even more. So we calculate the gap for these countries at only about 70 million, with the largest gaps being in Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, though, again, as in the case of Mongolia, they may have deals that are not public. So I think overall, again, I don't want to get complacent, but I think that while a year ago there was definitely not enough pre-purchase of vaccines, now we're almost at the point where we have enough funding to do it. So I want to take you through three options to fill this gap and talk about the pros and cons of each. The first would be just giving money to COVAX. So that seems to be what's happening. This is a chart from our paper. As I said, they were at 6.3 billion. That allowed them to get to about 16. We said if you give them 4 extra, you can get almost to 30, so to 28% coverage. So again, there's a little bit in like pricing and errors here, but additional financing for COVAX of about 4 billion would be sufficient for COVAX to make those orders. Two, and this is something. So this is in like the innovative financing category. An issue that COVAX faced was that they had these commitments, but the donor countries hadn't really given them money in the bank. So one thing to do would be actually for COVAX to borrow or rather the donor countries to borrow and then give the money they get from the loan to COVAX up front, so that COVAX has money at the bank. There's actually a way that countries do this already. I realize I'm running out of time. I'm getting there to the end. There's a way that countries do this already through the IFIM, so this Fund for Innovative Finance for immunization. And that basically allows countries to borrow in order to pay less upfront. This is an interesting option, but it also raises the question, well, why don't they just give the money up front? rich countries can borrow, they should just give it. So I think this is probably interesting, but not actually going to solve the problem because it's more complicated than countries just donating money. And then the third are vaccine donations. So, the rich countries have bought more than they need. That's enough probably to fill the gap twice over. You could think about distributing these through COVAX. I think one advantage of this is that COVAX has a lot of its production located in India, which is now requisitioning supply because it didn't order enough for itself. If there's production contracts in other locations, maybe that could be delivered faster, US production, for example. An advantage of using COVAX is that it has negotiated liability protection, in all the beneficiary countries. So that's another advantage. One downside, however, is that, the donated vaccines may require sort of colder storage, and so may be difficult to deploy in certain countries. So let me summarize. We're finally, I think, pretty close to having enough pre-purchases to cover 60% of the population. This should be about enough to achieve herd immunity. Of course, there'll be, some variation, but it's close. COVAX is asking for just $2 billion to achieve half of that. Regional and direct procurement would cover the rest. Donations are, I think, important to provide redundancy and also cover additional points of the population. And I'll make one point here, which is that so COVAX, has the way it's structured is they have to say, well, we'll promise we'll give everybody 30% coverage. But you might end up in situations where a country like Iran has 30%, but then it can't get further. Donations would be a way to sort of cover that additional gap. So I'm going to I don't like to make predictions, but I want to say that, given the purchases that have been made and the supply forecasts that you see from Airfinity and others, I think that you could get, basically all these shots in arms by June 2022. And this is sort of 1 quarter delayed, from the deadline that we said was possible in April, March. So, that's a pretty optimistic message. On the other hand, I want to say that this could, have come much earlier. If COVAX had all of the money in June of 2020, like the United States, you might have been able to deliver vaccines on the same timetable. People say, okay, well, there might be shortages of inputs and bottlenecks. That's true, but you would have resolved those, you would have known about those much earlier. And so since input suppliers also need time to scale production, they would have had that signal earlier. And this is, this is the discovery function of markets, and something that, I don't think that discovery of bottlenecks would have happened unless you had the orders, earlier on, or it could have happened earlier. So my key takeaway is that, you get what you pay for. I think that donor coordination failure and not market failure are the main explanation for slow vaccine delivery. The pre-purchase contracts were not complex or innovative. It was just, buying things. But then, a final point is that, the existing models of the DFIs were not set up to do the pre-purchases before regulatory approval. So this slowed things down. In this sense, the World Bank, it responded a lot to, general budget needs of countries. But in terms of the specific issue of buying vaccines in advance, its facility was not set up to do that. And so for this reason, I think something like COVAX, which has concessional capital and can go out into the market before regulatory approval, will be required to fight future pandemics quickly. I just want to make a note that in building on this 4 billion proposal, in our first paper, Ruchir and Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist at the IMF, proposed a larger program which has additional expenditure. So this is about the bulk of it is actually just sort of dealing with cases, testing, treatment, and protective equipment. But then they also have some funds for vaccine rollouts, buying fridges, and so forth. And then also they call it additional vaccine capacity. That's basically pre-purchasing vaccines in excess of this 60% of the population to deal with these downside risks that the virus becomes more transmissible or resistant. And then finally, I just want to make a note on capacity. I think that it's been speculated that countries don't have the capacity to do this. This is not actually true. So countries, especially in Africa, have a lot of experience with mass vaccination campaigns. I worked on the polio eradication effort in Nigeria, and here's just an example. Burkina Faso immunized half of its population, 11 million people, in 10 days against meningitis. So if you have the vaccines and you have the resources, this is definitely something that can be done. And I don't think the constraint is necessarily on the country capacity side. Final point, patent waivers. I think this has been talked a lot. I think it's clear to me, at least, that this isn't going to end the pandemic more quickly. It takes at least a year to scale up a new facility, and so it probably even if you did the patent waiver today, it wouldn't deliver for a year. A broader point is that it's probably not that bad an idea to waive patent protections in low and middle income countries. This won't alter the incentives of firms to develop drugs, since low and middle income countries are just a small share of their scales anyway. Penny Goldberg has made this point before. But waiving patent protection in rich countries could seriously harm innovation. So I think that that's something that should be protected. And I would not support waiving patent protections for Moderna and Pfizer in the United States to allow copycats producing here. But regardless of this point, whether you have patent protection or not, you're still going to need incentive funds to drive the development of drugs that affect viruses, fight diseases only in LMICs. So this is the example of the meningococcal vaccine. And then, so the second and final point I want to make is about emergency use authorization. So this issue comes up with well, how do you authorize the vaccine for use? Clearly, it's not efficient to have every country review the data at once. The current system relies on this set of what are called stringent regulatory authorities, which are only Western countries and Japan. This has a big problem because the Western countries don't plan to use vaccines produced by China, Russia, and India, and so they don't spend time reviewing them. The WHO has overcome this problem a little bit. It has reviewed Sinopharm, for example, and approved it. But we need more designated stringent regulatory authorities to kind of spread the burden of this this review and also make sure that every vaccine has a fair shot at being reviewed that's not subject to geopolitical concerns. So thank you. That's it. I know I've gone a bit over. I'm sorry for that, but hopefully we still have some time. Yeah.
So it was a tour d'horizon. So thanks a lot for presenting your work. There's lots to talk about here. I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. He, with Prashant and other colleagues, did do some work I think it was out in September last year, Anthony, that looked at prognostications about regulatory approval and the manufacturing capacity and when it would come online. Because one issue is that we are really only reliant on these manufacturing forecasts that are coming from company press releases or from Airfinity. So Anthony, maybe you can talk about that question. Other comments you have. I have a number of points that I'd like to make. I think the other thing is, of course, it's true that these, the pre-purchasing is arranged, but the timing of the receipt of the vaccines may matter a lot, as you say, because of the question of the variants. And therefore, the mix of whether it's, more money for pre-purchasing versus COVAX versus the donations in terms of timing could be quite important. But let's go to you, Anthony, and then I'll say a few things and we'll take some questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you, Tristan, for that really interesting presentation and indeed the excellent paper and the really interesting work. So yeah, in a role of discussant, I was just going to give my thoughts that I kind of came up reading your paper and then also as I listened to you. first of all, I think you're absolutely right on economics. Like the scale of this is so huge. It blows my mind that we've not pumped more money into vaccine research from day one. And it strikes me as almost a lack of imagination or a lack of understanding. We found out in the UK last week that in March 2020, when they were doing everything they could to get hold of PPE, that civil servants were turning down contracts because it was too above the normal price, or were working to put things that they bought in China on ships that would take 2 months to get to the UK, because that's how you always procure things for the NHS. And it seems like we've failed in many instances across this just to pull ourselves out of that normal box, including the European Union's price haggling and slow delays in coming up with contracts. And I think there's really big question for us in the future is how do we, be more imaginative earlier on in a process. And I really like that you've tried to do that, I think, right from the start, but particularly in this paper. You're right that we should absolutely, there should be more pre-demands, and there should have been more pre-demands, and there should be more money for that. I think like one part of this that's quite interesting I raised before in the pre-chat is that it's easier for high-income countries to do this, but as you've acknowledged, it's much harder for low and middle-income countries, particularly low-income countries, to make these commitments. So total health spending in Ethiopia is less than $25 per capita, and so spending $12 per course on everybody in Ethiopia to stop COVID it's a really tricky question. And total government expenditure in Ethiopia, I don't know the figure off the top of my head, but it's a little over $100. So again, these are huge figures, and really, it's not clear that it makes sense to vaccinate the whole country from Ethiopia's perspective. It absolutely, I think, makes sense from the world's perspective, and so we need to have a conversation about that. I think it personally, and I show my biases here, I don't even think it falls into the realm of development aid. I mean, we're paying this money for our own health. And I think your critique of multinational organizations and the loans are really, really interesting. We need to be better at not using stringent health regulators, or to balance stringent health regulators across the world in such a way, or to use more true WHO PPQ to get things done. I like that solution. I like the idea that there should be greater access to capital for COVAX and organizations like it in the future. And you're absolutely unquestionably right. We should donate more money for vaccines. I mean, it's understandable but questionable why people like me in my early 30s are getting vaccinated in the UK while doctors in sub-Saharan Africa aren't. But I don't think there's any debate or question about why people why the UK is likely to store doses, or the US is likely to store doses, while people who really need them across the world struggle with them. And even from a selfish point of view, again, we need to get these vaccines out to stop the pandemic coming back. And to give you an example, the United States hadn't had smallpox for 30 years or so at the point at which smallpox was eradicated, but the federal government still spent $2 billion a year in the 1970s money, testing people, limiting travelers, vaccinating people to make sure that smallpox didn't come back to the United States. And that $2 billion a year is saved. And I don't know the figure today, but it will be presumably closer to $10 billion a year, is saved completely every year, compounds, because we eradicated smallpox, and because those large investments went from both the Soviet Union and the United States and other countries into eradicating in parts of Africa. So again, I think there's a real selfish interest reason for doing this. I hope your analysis of the situation is right and my analysis is wrong, because I am slightly less optimistic about how we can get to the end of this crisis, whether it's in March or June 2022. The manufacturing question, our companies have grossly overestimated even how quickly they can manufacture vaccines throughout the course of this product. First of all, we don't have confidence intervals in any really reports of how many vaccines we're likely to get out. We only come up with base estimates. And I think that kind of shows you how little we know. But some sites work quite well. Other sites like AstraZeneca's in Australia or Novak's plants just seem to be plagued with problems being set up. Obviously, there was a big diplomatic incident when AstraZeneca did a better job getting their UK plant up and running than their European one. But these seem to be really hard to predict when things will come online. And all of the COVAX donations that you talked about follow and the African Union's purchases, they're predicated on those purchases, those vaccines being manufactured in the timelines that we're getting from companies. And I'm not as confident that that will happen. Similarly with components and stuff. And I think there probably are human capital constraints in the medium term. There are a limited number of people in the world who can understand these vaccines, and most of them are very busy at the moment. And so how much we can scale up production or continue to push the boundary of manufacturing capacity, it's an unknown. And finally, on this point, as Amanda says, we did some work kind of understand vaccine manufacturing timelines ourselves in late 2020. And one of the things that's really staggering is just the complete lack of knowledge of global manufacturing capacity. We really don't know where the manufacturing capacity plants are. There's no central oversight either of manufacturing or of their components. And so in many ways, we're flying blind. And the only people to do it, and they do great work, is Airfinity and Duke and a few others who rely solely on what the companies are telling them rather than going out and trying to vet it. CEPI did themselves go out and try and vet it with a survey, but very low response rates made it very difficult for them to come to terms with that. So I hope that somebody will take that mantle and go forward. Actually, secretly, I hope that we manage to secure funding to do that. But anyone doing it, I think,
Not
would be
so secretly. Okay.
Anybody doing it would be great for the world. On epidemiology, I'm also worried. You talk about how 20% of people in countries already have COVID, and so they're already immune. We don't know how long COVID immunity lasts. I mean, there's some estimates that within 6 months, people are getting vaccinated, getting sick again. There's a US Marines report which showed that 10% of people Marines who got COVID during March and April 2020 went on to get COVID again by the end of 2020. So I think that number will drop. And I also think it's likely we don't know how long COVID vaccine immunity will last. And so, I mean, these vaccines have been around for less than a year. It's less than a year since we were running the phase 3 trial. So we really don't know what's going to happen to these people, and will they need booster shots? And I think it's likely, it's sad, but it's likely that it will be people in high income countries who get those booster shots, possibly in a similar way that happened with Indian made vaccines, where they are diverted away from the people who, in my view, likely need them most. And possibly, even if we don't need booster shots, countries, the UK is already talking about this, will be careful and decide to use booster shots anyway, reducing the pool of vaccines that are available in the rest of the world. My next concern, and my biggest concern, is actually, like, I live in fear that I wake up one morning and I hear about a variant that tears through society and vaccines don't work against. And I think it's hard to be confident in that world. I mean, it's striking in your paper, you barely mentioned the Delta variant that started in India, and 6-7 weeks on, I live in the UK, it's more pronounced here, but 6-7 weeks on, all anyone talks about is the Indian variant. And it's possible that a variant comes out of nowhere in the next month that really does damage to our vaccinations. Already there's one in South Africa that if that spreads will mean that we can't use the AstraZeneca vaccine in large chunks of the world. African Union is already, I think, planning on the basis that the AstraZeneca vaccine won't work in sub-Saharan Africa, if not in all of Africa. And I think that, again, will dent the idea that we're just $4 billion away from achieving this. Finally, I know you're only focused on vaccines, but I do think it's really important to say we need non-vaccine solutions. I know you're just talking about making this endemic, not pandemic, but I think it's really clear. It's important to manage expectations because there will be future funding rounds, almost certainly. And I think it's really important to note that we will probably need to do stuff on testing possibly for decades. We will want to do stuff on booster shots at some point in vaccines. We will possibly want to do things like changing airspaces in busy parts of low and middle income countries. And possibly they need funding for that, because I really do believe that it's in our interest to try and eradicate this or control it across the world. But on balance, I think there's an excellent piece of research, and I think it takes us forward in that. And my points are somewhat nitpicky. And so thank you very much for a really thoughtful presentation and a thoughtful piece of work.
Thank you, Anthony. And I don't think nitpicky is not the word that I would use. I think that these are all really important points. And we have some questions and I want to get to them, but I just want to make a couple of other questions back to you before we let you respond to all these different things. So first, we count things like the African Union AVAT deal as done. We count those as doses in the bank, but even what we mean is that the Africa Export-Import Bank has indeed pre-purchased but they pre-purchased, assuming that governments of sub-Saharan Africa were going to buy those doses that they had bought from them, or repay them for the costs of purchase. There was a news article, now it's a month ago, that suggests that's not hasn't happened so much. Only 5 countries at that time had made even the down payment. And as you say, it's about having the money up front to get this done, to get the manufacturing done. The other issue with that is, again, the manufacturing capacity. So, J&J also announced it's just very frustrating to have to learn about everything from a press release. So that brings me to another point, and this was true of the COVAX deals. It's true of Operation Warp Speed. The contracts were never in the public domain. The deals always had to be deduced or talking to various people and hearing about it. Media ended up being the source for a lot of your mapping. And I just, I wonder if we had understood that better and been able to see those contracts and deals out in front, that would have been helpful to us. I think the other issue in the contracts is around, at the start of this response, the issue of speed was not, and the timing of delivery ends up being quite important. And so it's not just, did I buy it? It's where's my place in the queue and what's happening with the variants and the waves and the spread. So that's another piece that we have to think about. And I concur with Anthony, of course, and I think that the IMF et al. Proposal really does focus on, delivery costs are important too, non-vaccine interventions are important too. And one thing that you said, Anthony, is very, very important. This is not the last time that we're going to see a donor ask, what is our plan? We need a plan for that too. It can't be just, oh, it's just another 2 billion, then we'll be done. That's not how it's going to work. And so getting people on the same page in that, I think donor coordination failure is like the understatement of the year. It's just our lack of a collective ability to imagine this scenario as part of this problem, even though everyone talked about it. Now, let me go through some questions online, and then I'm going to come back to you, Tristan, to finish us up. So one is, if some of the leading vaccine manufacturers indeed have manufacturing capacity to take on new orders, why then do you think LMICs have not, low and middle income countries, have not purchased more doses of mRNA vaccines? Question mark. Do you think it's just the sort of delivery logistics issue, or what? We have a question from our non-resident fellow. That question was for Prashant. This question is from John Hicklin, who's a non-resident fellow who's been writing about a financing window at the IMF that would be able to, give easy money for balance payment support that would enable countries to pay in quickly. A question to you is the financing available really a constraint here, or is it more formalizing the demand? As you said, India had plenty of money. Why didn't they order in advance? If you can reflect on that. From Katri Bertram, she asks, is money enough? What happens if COVAX is fully funded, but doesn't get access to vaccine doses early enough? So that's sort of this issue, as you were saying, it's late money. Are we really, where's their place in line, right? Given all of the other commitments that have already been made. And then from Dan Peters at the Gates Foundation, he asks, Tristan, you lay out a persuasive case around the importance of pre-purchases in order to ensure adequate supply of vaccine. Did you conduct interviews with officials from donor governments or at the bank in OPCS, which is their procurement group, to better understand what looks to be a very conservative financing approach in retrospect? Why do you think donors were so reluctant to put their contributions at risk when the payoffs to pre-purchase were so large? And why really when you look again, even in the US, on the one hand, well, we had different government at that time. Let's take the UK instead. The UK knew and was had done some of the same things that Operation Warp Speed did. They did only bet on a couple of vaccines. They didn't have as diversified a portfolio of vaccines from which they pre-purchased, as far as I understand. But they did that, domestically, they were taking that approach. Why didn't they go bigger on COVAX, or why didn't they get the bank to go bigger on COVAX at that stage? Do you have any thoughts on that? And then, we understand that the MDB is a country-driven model, but why couldn't the bank have requested extraordinary flexibility from its board some of the board members obviously have been interested in this issue for some time. And I know that you're here in a personal circumstance, so we might just leave that last one open and come back to it in our own writing later. But thanks so much. This was a great talk. So we'll take it back to you and then we'll wrap up.
Great, thanks. That's a lot there. So, so let me just summarize. My main point is that you need to pre-purchase the vaccine. So, we're not even talking at this point about more money. I'm saying the money that you're finalizing today could have been given a year ago, and that's that would have made a huge difference. So I'm not even asking for more money. I agree that we'll need to purchase it, but if you can only take home that one thing, just donors should have got on board a year ago. Let me go to I think one of the issues on the supply constraints. I think you've seen very slow deliveries of COVAX. A lot of that has to do with India, right? So they did not buy Chinese vaccines. That which are available and being exported, rapidly. They bought from Indian suppliers. That was a concentration risk, actually, that the African Union recognized. They said that one of the reasons we're in the market is because this Indian production is not secure, and the reason that's not available is because the Indian government itself did not make orders. So that they're I mean, you might have still faced supply constraints, but at least Poonawalla said, I only had 1 billion orders. So that there is this issue that I think, and then sort of to Prashant's question about why LMICs haven't ordered more from Pfizer. I think part of that, is that it is more difficult. It does require a freezer. The cold chain is more demanding. But I think there was also this sense that countries said, okay, well, COVAX has us covered. We don't need to go to the market. And I think, one of the things they said early on was that we're only targeting 20%. And in a lot of the early, World Bank operations, they hadn't even thought, and I'm saying not just the bank, the country plans had not, gone beyond, to 60%. And so there just wasn't this sense that, we actually are going to need to cover all the populations. And so it came, sort of, in piecemeal fashion. I want to say on the DFIs, the main thing there was the regulatory requirement. So they said, we're not going to buy something that hasn't been approved. And, the phrase was, this is prudent. I was not in the board meetings, but I think there were political economy considerations. I think that, the Chinese vaccines were available. China had the pandemic under control. I don't know, this is an interesting fact. It's exported half of domestic vaccine production. The facilities that were established were created in such a way that they would not buy those vaccines. And now they can, because Sinopharm has been, approved by the WHO, and the requirements have been reduced so that you can, WHO is sufficient. It used to be, by the way, that the World Bank said WHO is not sufficient. You need 3 SRAs in different regions. So the US, Europe, Japan, it's very hard to rationalize that, I think, from a totally efficient, totally economic perspective. Why didn't donors pay more? Again, I think that, it was a lot of money. I mean, the US put 18 billion about in Operation Warp Speed. I'm saying that you needed 10 for the rest of the world. It's not that much, but that also, that would have needed authorization from Congress, and that's very hard to get for anything. So I do think that there could have been more innovation from the DFI level, but at the same time, you needed concessional capital from donors to kind of take a risk. And I think, I'll say a final point. On the African Union, I think they are really an example of how to do this. So, Amanda, you said they've, made a contract, but the countries may not have ordered that, but they did pay Johnson & Johnson through the Africa Export-Import Bank. So Johnson & Johnson has that cash. It has a contract that, it will get the demand that it needs, and it's scaling up production now. So, African Union may be in a situation where they have too many vaccines, then they can't get rid of them, but at least, the orders have been made. So I think, just that point that, like, you get what you pay for. You have to put the money in and you have to put it early. If we can remember that, in the next pandemic, and hopefully put some to measure to guard against these downside risks going forward, I think that would be very valuable. Anyway, thank you,
Great.
everyone. I know we've been over.
Okay, thanks so much, Tristan and Anthony. This has been a great conversation. I hope the first of many. There's so much more to discuss here. You put out two ideas at the end of your presentation that we didn't even get to, and is a very hot topic, obviously, right now. So we'll come back to you on some of those. But thanks also to the audience for joining us, and stay in touch. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.